Hello everyone and welcome to a new series on this channel with me, Billie. And so it's basically just an excuse for me to read books and talk about them, and for you to read books and talk about them, or to learn about books and talk about them if you don't have the time to read the actual books. So yeah, when I think about BTS, one of the main things that I love so much about them is just how much inspiration and credit and influence they get from different cultural forms, and culture meaning the artistic culture, like the art, literature, dance kind of culture, rather than identity culture, you know what I mean? So yeah, one of the main things that I love so much about them is how when you go into their work and you find these little things, and then you can go and research that text and learn about that text, and then the context behind the text, the background of it, what it was used for in their art, and how it amplified their own voices. And that's one of the things that I love to do the most when I look into BTS's music. And there's just so much within their work, and also that they've just recommended, and I mean, I think that's just as cool to learn about, because say Namjoon recommended a book for some reason. It gives me a better idea into his mind, into what he thinks, what he found interesting, and then it allows me to see his own art in like a new format, if you know what I mean. And what I wanted to do was kind of dive back into my background a bit and do some research and read the tales and have a think and get creative and create something like this so that we can all do so together, because I don't know about you, but I've missed being able to talk with people about books and about culture and things I've been watching, things I've been reading, and what I thought about it. And you know, it's just one of my favourite activities. So I thought, we don't really have anything like this here on this channel, and it's something I'm so passionate about, and I thought maybe other people might enjoy it as well. So that's an overview of what this is and what I'm going to be doing. So my academic background is in literature, sociology and culture, and a bit of psychology and a bit of philosophy, but just those kind of like humanitarian subject matters. And I did an undergrad in contemporary literature and sociology with a bit of psychology, and I did my master's, or I started my master's in contemporary literature and culture. So I'm very fascinated in what makes our world today, how was it influenced by past thinking and creating, and how do people use art and culture to present messages to people, to make people think, and how is that done today, where our whole landscape has changed in terms of how we view and appreciate art. You know, like before it was always, let's go to an art exhibition and see things, or the books would be printed chapter by chapter each week in the newspaper and people might discuss it. And in today's day and age, we have so much going on, and so much from what's considered low art, which I hate this distinction, but low art, that which is within the public sphere and is popular, and high art, which is that in art galleries and, you know, la. But something that's been really fascinating is the intertwining of these two formats and them coming together and being taken more seriously in today's day and age by both elements of society, and finding that actually there's a lot to be said in both areas. And BTS does this very, very well. They combine things that are popular and things that are easy to digest maybe, or are more grasping to the senses straight away, with things that take time, things that need to be thought about, things that need to be mulled over, you know. So yeah, this series, I'm calling it books, but I might incorporate other things. I think we'll just see there's so much stuff that they've recommended over the years. But books, TV, film, art pieces, just lots of different things. I think it might be a cool way of really delving into BTS's art in a more interesting format. So yeah, today's episode, number 1, is going to be about the short story The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Guin. And there was a couple of reasons why I chose this for the first one, and the first being that it's very short. It's a very short story, so it's quite easy to digest, both for me and for others who, like, this is the first episode, we're experimenting, we're seeing how it goes and what we think about it. And The second reason is that I really like Ursula K. Guin, and I've been meaning to read this short story for a while. She's a fantastic and really intriguing figure, both within literature and sociology, because of her kind of innovation and coming up with new things. She has some great work in utopian studies, dystopian studies, feminism, environmentalism, and anarchism as well, which is really fascinating. So yeah, some of her main themes are those that I've just talked about, and she's got a huge body of work, some incredible things, and I wanted to just give you a little bit of a spoiler-free opinion on this text from me, but this whole video is kind of going to be filtered with spoilers throughout, lots and lots of spoilers. But if you haven't read it, you can find it online, it's very short, and if you don't have time to read it, I will provide you with an overview and a summary as well, so you kind of know what's going on. So yeah, if you don't mind that, we'll still be able to talk about it. My thoughts on this text. I think what's really interesting about it is, again, it's very interdisciplinary. It combines things in a way that I find quite fascinating. So it's a literary text. It employs literary devices, but it also brings in a lot of questions from philosophy, from sociology, from psychology, and all different types of things in such a short amount of time. And the other thing that it does is it makes you be an active participant in this storytelling. It's not just sit back, listen to what I'm saying, and enjoy or observe, like a lot of storytelling is these days, sadly. What it does is say, we are a partnership here. This text and you, we are working together. We are collaborating in a sense to figure out what's going on here. And so that's something I really, really love about this story. I also love how many interesting messages there are, how much you can apply such a short story to so many existing examples in society, so many things. I read it and I thought, that reminds me of this, that reminds me of this, that reminds me of this. And especially with BTS, so many of their things can be tracked in this story, so many of their ideas. Now, we're going to look mainly into philosophy today and how this raises questions of morality, of ethics, and of right and wrong. And then we're going to be looking at some real life cases, some examples of how this is kind of prevalent within our own society. But that's my kind of opinion overall, and I think it's really well done. I think it's really interesting, and I really like the story. So yeah, I would really highly recommend. So yeah, just to give you kind of an idea of what we're going to be doing, we'll go through a literary analysis and we'll look at some quotes and pick it apart and see what it means and how the author has used her literary platform to, provide meaning or something like that and whatever. And I'll give you a summary as well in that. And then we're going to go and look into moral and ethics theory, which is a kind of branch in philosophy, and kind of see how Western moral philosophy is kind of pictured, how it's studied, and how it interlinks with this text, what this text is asking from you. Then we're going to go on to talk about BTS's music video Spring Day, and also the Sewol Ferry Tragedy. So there is going to be some sensitive topics in here, and I would just ask everyone be respectful, kind, compassionate, when we talk about this type of thing. It's really sad. So then we will go on and we will tie everything together and we will talk in a summary. And that's about it, really. So yeah, let's get started. So, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. As I said, it was in a short story collection. It was first published in 1973, and it has been republished in other story collections since that time. It's been quite a prominent text within thought experiments, and we'll talk a bit more about what thought experiments are later, but it's just used in classes a lot, from what I've seen, from what I've gathered. And it talks on topics of utopia, of dystopia, of morality, and it's really fascinating. We've already kind of covered this. So to give you a summary of the story, I've kind of split it into 3 sections that I've found from the structure. So breaking those down, we've got number 1, establishing the utopia, the perfect society. We go in and we learn about what this city is like, what the people are like, how they look. This imagery is spread, and we're encouraged to take part in the creation of it. And it's kind of this city is like this, and it has no problems with this, and it has everything great with this, and how would you picture it, and what would you add, and those kinds of things. So we have this establishing of Omelas, of this wonderful utopia, and utopia is just kind of, in broad terms, a kind of perfect world of everything's great, everything's wonderful. So then we go on to the second part, which is exposing the dystopia. Dystopia is the opposite of utopia, and I'm sure a lot of people will have heard of this. It's been very, very common in our popular culture in the last 20-30 years or so, with lots of text and fiction and things surrounding it. If you've heard of The Hunger Games or Divergent or all those types of things, Black Mirror, stuff like that. So yes, then we go and we find out that this perfect world, this perfect utopia, is all possible simply because of the suffering of one child, and this child is kept in horrific conditions, is in a small tiny room in the dark. It's unhygienic conditions, it's neglected, it doesn't get to talk to anyone. It's just this child whose life is made for suffering. And we find out that everybody knows what's happening in this utopia. Everybody knows this is happening. Most of the people will go at some point to see it for themselves. Usually they're young when they do so, and they learn about it and they go to see what's going on. And the majority of these people, as we go into the third section, responses and decisions, the majority of these people decide that they can live with this, they can accept this. They might not understand it, they might understand it, but if this is the way it is, they can accept it and they move on and they live in this happy utopia, and the child is forced to stay in their dystopia. And we also have some people in the city of Omelas who decide that they can't live with this, they can't justify this, and they can't just continue living in this perfect happy society when they know the truth of what's happening and what the cost is. So those are the ones who walk away from Omelas. So that should hopefully give you a bit of a overview of what the story is about. And let's go on and talk about these three sections in a bit more detail. So, Utopia. Now, the first use of Utopia was in a book written, I think, in the 15th century. Don't quote me on this, I studied this a long time ago, but it was by a man named Thomas More, I believe, and his book was called Utopia, I think, but I should have fact-checked this before I did this, but yes, he was the first use of the word utopia. He created this, and the story was kind of about a man going off to a distant land and finding this incredible society, and this is where the term comes from and is used to this day. And it's kind of a play on words. It's a mixture of two Greek words, I'm sorry for my pronunciation, but utopos and utopos, which means no place, utopos, and utopos meaning good place. So if you were to write this in a sentence, as I've put here, it's kind of a good place which does not exist. And this was the kind of creation of the word utopia, what it was used for, and it was kind of this idea that it's the most perfect society and it's not real, it's just fantasy, it's fiction. And this is really interesting when you actually think about what the word has been used for and how it has developed over time, because in the modern era of art, of society and culture, it was very much focused on the divine, the beauty of everything, and everything is wonderful, and I'm simplifying things here and generalizing, but it was this focus on enlightenment and beauty and joy and finding meaning and happiness. And a lot of people believed in the idea of a utopia, of a perfect world, of a perfect society, and where everyone would be happy and everyone would be, able to do what they wanted to do. And over time, utopia and the idea of utopia kind of shifted. And that was a lot to do with the fact that things like communism started spreading, things like Nazism started spreading, and this idea that somebody's version of a utopia can end up becoming something very totalitarian, something very repressive, authoritative, and would restrict everyone and would cause acts of evil. And so people saw the dark side of the utopia. If somebody is to say this is the perfect world and try to implement that perfect world, then it might be a complete dystopia to another person. And think about this story. Somebody's idea of a utopia is Omelas, but Omelas is a dystopia to the child. And that was similar in kind of elements of communism and these types of things where you have people trying to enforce their version of a perfect world. And it wasn't taking into account the fact that every person's version of a utopia will be different. Nobody's going to be the same. It's going to be subjective. And so the idea of a perfect world where everyone can live perfectly, it's just not possible because everyone is different. Everyone has different ideas. And if you try to enforce that on others, then you're taking away their free will. So Utopia kind of developed into this idea of anti-utopia after, the Second World War, after the fight between capitalism and communism. People were very much wary of the idea of utopia and would actively want to prevent the utopia. We don't want to think of a perfect world because look what has happened to it. We will question everything that seems too perfect. We will make everything sarcastic and expose everything. And this is postmodernism. And postmodernism was a really important element of our history. And one of the main things that comes from postmodernism is the advancements of certain fields such as feminism, such as post-colonialism, such as queer theory. And a lot of these marginalized, underrepresented voices were able to expose what was being seen as a perfect world, a utopia, happy, beautiful, yay, and say, this is all rubbish, and look at the problems that is being hidden underneath all of this. You are just selling a lie. It's not real, and we're going to expose it, and we're going to show you what's underneath. So it was a really important time in our history. And as time went on, utopianism has started to mean something else. There's still this very prevalent idea of anti-utopianism because people will mock, utopian beliefs and hopes and dreams as being silly and unintelligent. And to think real, you have to see things critically, and you have to think of things from an outside perspective and question them and make fun of them. And that's great to a certain extent, but what kind of happened within our society was that everything suddenly became a joke. There was no option for things to be better, and if something was bad, then instead of changing it, we would just be like, yeah, this is bad, obviously. You know what I mean? So utopian studies started changing around the time of Ursula Le Guin's rise, actually, within her field, and she talks a lot about utopias. And it started meaning something different. So the utopia was no longer the perfect world. It was this idea that if you are looking towards the future and you are hoping for something better than what we have right now, then that is utopian. It's no longer this idea of creating perfection, because perfection is not possible, it's subjective. But it's this idea that we can form something better than the world we live in today. And there's still this kind of fight between these two ideas of, that's silly, that's stupid, if you care about anything, then that's ridiculous, and let's just be cynical and sarcastic about everything, versus this idea of, let's hope for something better, let's try to make a change, let's believe in things, and I think that's one of the reasons BTS resonates so much with this society, because this society is kind of fed up with that constantly questioning of everything, of settling for what we're told is the way that it is and it can't be any differently. BTS is this new idea of utopianism, of hope for the future, for something better. So I wanted to just go into utopian studies a bit and the history of it and how it has changed over time, because it's really interesting and all of the elements of it kind of have interesting points that I agree with and points that I don't agree with. But yeah, it's just a cool thing to look into. So we're going to look at some of the quotes now to do with the first section of the text, which is building the utopia. And this is how the author kind of, and the narrator sets the scene for Omelas, for the utopia. So, first quote. There was no king. They did not use swords or keep slaves. They were not barbarians. I do not know the rules and laws of their society, but I suspect there were singularly few. The reason I picked out this quote is that I think it's always important when you read literature, when you look into art forms of any kind, to question things, to think, what is this not telling me? Or what is this telling me? What can I attain from this, from my own independent thinking on the matter? And so the thing that I found interesting about this is when we're setting out this scene of this utopia, of this Omelas, the narrator is somebody that is not too reliable. Now, they're not just doing one thing where they're saying, I don't really know what's going on, let's figure it out together. They're not just saying, this is how it was, this is how it was. It's a mixture of these two things. It's like, this is what happened, but I'm not too sure on what happened. And so I think that this is something to keep in mind, that this society and this painting of this picture is something that we can't really rely on. It's something that we have to think about. So yeah, that was the first thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of this, and keep that in the back of your mind, is that we don't really know the truth of the matter. We don't really know what is real, what is not real, but the point that is trying to be laid across here is that this is great, this is wonderful. So there's no oppressive forces of authority, there's no violence, there's no oppression, they don't hurt each other, and it works so well that there's not even many rules to keep it going, because people just are great and wonderful. Yay. So next quote. They were not naive and happy children, though their children were in fact happy. They were mature, intelligent, passionate adults whose lives were not wretched. Oh, miracle. I love the little oh, miracle here. It's kind of like, I think we can kind of ascertain what element and what side the narrator is in this. It kind of seems a bit satirical, but it's also like the narrator wants you to believe this. They want you to understand that this is the truth. You can't just dismiss it. And this is for the reason I was talking about before, is that this utopian rhetoric and this idea of a utopia was very much like, yeah, whatever. It was just immediately brushed aside and thought, I'm not taking this seriously. I don't believe in this crap. It's stupid. So this narrator and the author is trying to pull you in and say, like, no, actually think about it for a second. Like, they're not naive. They're not children. I'm telling you this. This is something I can tell you. They're mature, intelligent, passionate. They're adults, and their lives were actually not wretched. They were actually living happily. Like, I know it seems crazy. I know it seems impossible, because in your society and in your world, everything is just, it doesn't work like that. It's all kind of falling apart and very dystopian. So the narrator is trying to get you to do that here. I fear that Omelas so far strikes some of you as goody-goody. Smiles, bells, parades, horses, blah. If so, please add an orgy. If an orgy would help, don't hesitate. And again, we've got this idea of like, I want to make this seem legitimate in your eyes. I want you to understand that this is real, that this isn't just something airy-fairy that like we can just dismiss as wishful thinking and dreams. And I always think of that that girl from Mean Girls, if you've watched it, if you know the reference of, I just wish everything could be all rainbows and smiles and happiness, and people are like, oh god, like, ugh, roll your eyes, this is ridiculous. And that was a very common sentiment during that time of that kind of thing. So let's add something sexually devious to make you think that it is more believable, because that's still a good thing in this society for people. People like sex, people like being free and, like experimenting. So let's have orgies, let's have people all having sex together. And this is a way of, again, adding legitimacy to it, saying, it's not just this pure, like, childlike utopian that is something that can't be taken seriously. If it will help you understand it better, let's add something a bit sexually deviant that doesn't seem like something that you could talk about in a utopia of, naivety, I suppose. So again, these were not simple folk, not dulcet shepherds, noble savages, bland utopians. They were not less complex than us. And so this is a way of kind of calling out the commentary that is given upon utopians, you people who believe in these kinds of things. So from the perspective of the audience, especially at this time, it's, if you believe in a perfect society, you are either stupid, simple, you are a follower and you don't think for yourself, you are an upper class person who will exploit and take advantage of and prey on others, or you are a bland utopian, just overall, like you are ridiculous. You are one of those utopians, said with malice. It's not something that we think of as a good thing. It's ridiculous. And they go on to say, the author goes on to say, or the narrator, goes on to say, they were not less complex than us. Here is where you're really pulled into the story as an active participant, and it's very much all these things and all these assumptions that you have made about these people. I'm telling you they're not true, and I'm telling you that we're the same. You and the person that you are reading about in this story are the same, have the same thoughts, have the same feelings, are not silly, are not being brainwashed, are not all of these types of things. They're just like us, so I want you to think about it like that, and I want you to think about yourself in this situation. Perhaps it would be best if you imagine... Typo Billie. Bad literature student. Perhaps it would be best if you imagined it as your own fancy bits, assuming it will rise to the occasion, for certainly I cannot suit you all. The narrator here is actively understanding that, okay, this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to make you believe in this society, and I'm trying to paint this picture for you. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to be able to suit all of your ideas of a perfect world. And see how this ties back into what I was talking about previously, is that utopianism cannot be just labelled and restricted to one thing. It cannot just be a perfect world with no room for change, because everyone that envisions their idea of a perfect world would be different. Like, if I think to myself, what is a perfect world? I would think, everybody's treated equally, there's no pain, there's no suffering, maybe there's free everything. I could buy anything I wanted whenever I wanted, and there was always enough for everybody, and there was enough land, and the environment was stable and thriving, and this would be my way of creating my idea of a perfect world. And if I asked you all to do the same, it would be different. Like, maybe we would have some similarities. Maybe you would have things that I don't care about. Like, maybe you would say something like, oh, I wish all the sports facilities were the best in the world because I'm really into sport and I love it. And I would say, bleh, I wish I was healthy as possible without having to do sport. So it's all different for everyone. And that's what this author is trying to explain here, is like, I'm trying to present you with a utopia, but I'm not going to force it on you, and I'm not going to make it something that is static, is immovable, because every one of you will have a different idea of it. So this is already making it a more possible thing to imagine, and something that people won't be afraid of, because the fear comes from this idea of being suppressed based on somebody else's idea of a utopia, So you are now told, I want you to help me create this. And each one of you as an individual has their own thoughts, has their own feelings, and is going to be an active participant in this story for me. And because of that, you will be able to see it more clearly. You will be able to participate in it and maybe understand what happens later and what comes later a bit more than you might have done previously. If it was just, this is what it is, you might just immediately dismiss it, but this is already leaning towards this new idea of utopianism. So we're moving on to dystopia, which is the opposite of this. And again, the reason dystopia kind of came around and was so prominent in our society, in our popular culture, was because of this idea that utopianism was dead. We couldn't imagine a perfect world, but we could imagine a world where everything was horrible. We could think that we're leading to a place where it's all going to be terrible, where fear persists and we have to overcome trials, because that seemed like something that was easier to digest. And what it is, it comes from the Greek word of dystopos, which means bad place. So we're going on to the second part of the narrative now, where it's exposing the dystopia. So we've had this whole setting the scene and getting you involved and kind of questioning your own prejudices against a utopia. And what is said at the end is, you still don't believe me? Well, how about this? Let me show you this. And that is the dystopia, or the cost, the price that has to be paid in order for this utopian society to be there, to exist. It could be a boy or a girl. It looks about 6, but actually it is nearly 10. It is feeble-minded. Perhaps it was born defective, or perhaps it has become imbecile through fear, malnutrition, and neglect. So we're talking about the dark side of this society now, the dystopia. And we're talking about innocence, vulnerability, mistreatment, and dehumanization. You know, it's referred to, even I'm saying it because that's how it's described in the text, but they are referred to as an it, as something which is not human, as something which is object, which is a process of dehumanization that has been seen a lot in our history of they are not human, they are less than human, which means that we can justify our treatment of them in the way that we justify eating meat. We are simply predator, they are not the same as us. This is a technique that's been put in here, but it's also been made clear that this child is the picture of vulnerability and innocence, and it's horrifying. It's something that we should be protecting. It's something that, because of the treatment that it has faced, it has suffered to such an extreme level. Fear, malnutrition, neglect, you know. So this is the exposing of this dystopia and the idea that this one child is in these horrible conditions to suit the rest of society. One of them may come in and kick the child to make it stand up. The others never come close, but peer in at it with frightened, disgusted eyes. Now I find this passage to be really significant in our own society, because this is the truth of what happens now. You know, like, we have a couple of individuals in the world who are pure evil, who do these things and are evil and horrible and actively participate in violence and in just doing things just because, like kicking a child that is already basically completely defenseless and living in these despicable conditions, but kicking this child just because they can, you know. But the others, and this is what I find interesting, they never come close. They just peer at it from a distance. And this tends to be what a lot of people in society do, is that we're just going to stay away and observe and not participate because we're not horrible people, you know, like, we're not going to actively do this. That would make us feel bad. But we're going to just not do anything about it. We're going to watch it from afar. We're going to see it. And we're going to be frightened of it. But that's a selfish interest. We are frightened of this defenseless child. And we're going to be disgusted by it. We are going to feel like us having to witness this is something that's disgusting to us. And I think this is where the main problem in our society lies, is that while, in my opinion, humanity may not be inherently evil and ugly and want to hurt others, there are enough who just will stand back and do nothing, and who are just as culpable in the crime happening as those committing the act. They all know it is there, all the people of Omelas. Some of them have come to see it, others are content merely to know it is there. They all know that it has to be there. Some of them understand why, and some do not, but they all understand that their happiness depends wholly on this child's abominable misery. So again, this is a rule in this society, is that every person who belongs there knows what is happening. Some will have gone to see for themselves, some won't have wanted to and will have just said, I know this is what's happening. You've told me I don't need to go and see it for myself. It's kind of accepted as fact. This is the way it has to be. We all know it has to be this way. We might not understand, we might understand, but if we want to be happy, this child has to suffer, and we know that. And that's something to clock into your mind for later, because I think that's quite significant. And the other thing of note here is just that, you know, it's this idea that my happiness relies on you suffering. The kind of scales balancing act is that if I get to be happy, then you have to suffer. This is another idea that we'll talk a lot about a bit later on. And this idea of like a law of the jungle type thing of, if I want to survive, if I want to persevere and have my chances, then I have to just focus on myself and sacrifice others to be able to do so. And that's how I'll survive. So it's just this idea of somebody's utopia resting on the back of somebody else's dystopia. And keep that in mind. No matter how well the matter has been explained to them, these young spectators are always shocked and sickened at the sight. They feel disgust, which they had thought themselves superior to. They feel anger, outrage, impotence, despite all the explanations. They would like to do something for the child, but there is nothing they can do. Now, we were talking earlier about how everybody kind of learns about this society and what's happening in this society, and it's said in the text that usually around the age of 12, the children or the young people will go to view it for themselves, will get told about it, and will decide that they want to see what's happening for themselves. And the thing that I think the author is trying to say here with this section is that, one, they are on the side of humanity is inherently good, but we are taught and we learn and develop to do bad things, which is, there's kind of two schools of thought, is that we are born bad, but we learn to restrict ourselves, or we are born good, but we learn to accept bad things. So this author is on that side of the argument from what we can see in this story. And the other thing is that it's this idea of the youth, and the youth being those that feel that compassion, those that feel that anger, those that want to do something, those that want to change something. And this has been very prevalent across societies, across countries, all over, of youth activists and of the youth kind of like wanting to, you know, make a change, make a difference. And, you know, often we see it, like in my own country, I see it all the time, of the left politics is usually largely dominated by the youth, and the right politics is largely the elderly, and usually the bracket right at the top of it, the age groups. And I think you can see this here, because this is the same thing I experienced, this anger, this like feeling of powerlessness, of being unable to do something but wanting to do something because they don't agree with it, and people try to explain it to them. This has to happen because of this, and this has to happen because of that. But the youth are very much, but that doesn't matter. I don't care about any of that because it's wrong. It shouldn't be this way. And I'm thinking of an example of something like, well, our economic system has to run like this because that way we can influence the market and we can be a great global power, and in order for that to happen, like, we have to take away some things from the poorest of society. And that is kind of the justification that would be used, but a lot of the time for the youth it's very much, well, who cares about that? We don't care about that because it's wrong. We care about the fact that this many people are living in poverty, and that's what we care about, and I don't care what your explanation is. It's wrong and we want to fix it. And so that's just kind of an example, and I think that that's what this author is kind of drawing upon here, and she does so in some of her other works of, you know, when you're young, you kind of have this feeling, this overwhelming feeling, not everyone, I am generalizing here, but from my experience, the majority, from what I've seen, you kind of have this feeling of wanting to fight against injustice, seeing things and you can't explain them, and you want to do something about it, but you feel very powerless because the system has been created on the backs of those that came before us, you know. And a lot of the time we are kind of, you know, outranked or outnumbered by those in power and those who are older. So it's kind of like, no matter how hard you try, it doesn't really make a difference. And I mean, again, I think this is very clear all around the world, in society, in politics. We have a saying in our country, in the UK, and you have kind of two main political parties, the Labour on the left and the Conservatives on the right. And there's a saying that goes something along the lines of, if you are a young person and you don't support Labour, then you have no compassion. And if you are an old person and you don't support Conservatives, then you have no intelligence. And that's kind of this overwhelming idea, is that when you are young, when you don't know any better, which is what they usually use as an argument, then you will feel this compassion towards left side politics, towards change and wanting to do these things. And as you get older, you will kind of lose that, and you will think of things from an intellectual standpoint. I'm using quotation marks a lot here because I am a young person and I do fall in on that side, and I do think it's ridiculous to try to explain these things and try to say, but money, but economics, but we need to be stable for this and this and this, and we need to be powerful for this. Like, whatever. Yeah, let's move on. So this final section 3 of this story, I've kind of labelled it as like responses, because we get a lot of responses in terms of what the characters in the narrative do, how they respond, how they react to these things. And we're also left with it very open of, you know, how would you respond as the reader? How would you want to respond? But how do you think you would respond? Can you see anything else outside of this response? You know, like, it's left very open to interpretation, to the point where you are not given a conclusion, you are not given a resolve, it's not told to you. So you feel unsatisfied and you feel like you have to sit there and think longer about it. And I've described this as a thought experiment. And a thought experiment, I've got a definition here from Oxford Bibliographies, is thought experiments are performed in the imagination. We set up some situation, we observe what happens, then we try to draw appropriate conclusions. In this way, thought experiments resemble real experiments, except that they are experiments in the mind. And this text is an example of a thought experiment. It's kind of saying, okay, we're setting up this society, we're setting up the cost of this society, we're giving you some things that people do, and then we're leaving it open and saying, and you, what do you think? What would you do? It's not actively asked, but it's implied. And that's what I think makes this a thought experiment. And we'll go over a couple more thought experiments later on, like drawn up ones. But yeah, that's just the first thing I wanted to point out. So let's go on to some responses from the characters. Often, the young people go home in tears or in a tearless rage when they have seen the child and faced the terrible paradox. They may brood over it for weeks or years, but as time goes on, they begin to realise that even if the child could be released, it would not get much from its freedom. A little vague pleasure of warmth and food, no doubt, but little more. It is too degraded and imbecile to know any real joy. It has been afraid too long ever to be free of fear. Its habits are too uncouth for it to respond to humane treatment. Indeed, after so long, it would probably be wretched without walls about it to protect it, and darkness for its eyes, and its own excrement to sit in. Their tears at the bitter injustice dry when they begin to perceive the terrible justice of reality, to accept it. And so, this is kind of what I was talking about, is that, you know, over time, the youth tend to change their ideas and tend to accept the justice of reality. And this is probably the most powerful. This passage and the next one that we're going to read, I would say, are probably the most powerful to me throughout this story. Because, like, if we break this down, this is what happens in our societies. This is how people's opinions change about things. So, you know, maybe we see something and we just think, this is just vile, this is horrific. And we go home and we are heartbroken, we're enraged about it, and we see that it's so wrong. But then, you know, as time goes on, people start making justifications for this. Because, you know, it's easier that way. It's easier to make choices from within the pre-existing society that we have been given than to think outside of it and to say, how can we change this? How can we make this something else? A lot of the times, people will just accept that this is the way that it is, and I don't like it, so I need to come up with a way of being able to accept it. So, you know, maybe first the thing that they would do is think, well, you know, they've suffered so much, so even if they were given the great things, even if they were given freedom, it wouldn't really matter to them in the way it would matter to me. I will appreciate it more because they won't be able to. They've, you know, suffered for so long that they don't understand what it means to have these things. They will forever be this way, and it's very much this idea of a victim being a victim, not a survivor, not somebody that can fight, that can come back from it, that we see a lot in stories. And the thing to account for when we talk about this is that all of these decisions are made by the person in question without giving a regard to the voices of those who are being oppressed, of those who are the victims of this situation. It's, well, I know better and I can figure it out, and you might tell me that this is what you want, but it's not, because I know that it wouldn't make a difference anyway, And then we come to the even more ridiculous as we go further down, well, it's been in this dark room, so enclosed and covered in filth for so long that it needs that now. It needs that to survive, if it wasn't living that way, it would miss that, because those walls protect it, and it would want that protection from the walls. And it seems ridiculous when you think about it, but it's very often seen. And this argument was made about things like slavery, Well, they couldn't manage themselves because they've been taught to obey. So it doesn't matter what anybody says. We need to be the masters because they need someone to follow. And it's ridiculous, right? But this is how people will justify it to themselves, because they don't want to accept the fact that their initial response to what was happening and what they thought about it, maybe some do, maybe some don't, is that they are wrong and they are behaving immorally. But this is how people justify this type of behavior, and it's very powerful how it's put in this text, because it seems when you read it like, that's ridiculous, that's horrific, how could they think something like that? But this happens, and that's kind of what it's drawing your attention to. So, over time, people go, I understand, I get it, I can live with this, I can accept this situation, I can participate in this environment, because I have decided that I know what's best for this person. And again, it's this idea of, making sense of your environment from within instead of actively working to change it. And now you can place blame at the feet of the people that participated in these things, the individuals themselves. I think you really can. And because they haven't had the foresight to, think outside the box, think more deeply about things. They have allowed themselves to start these justifications. No matter if they were young and they were enraged and they were heartbroken, over time they have allowed themselves to be influenced by the society around them because it was easier that way. And so we can place blame at the feet of those people. But the thing that's most important to consider here is about how the capital and the society is controlling these options and is giving you the appearance that this is the only way to be. And I think it's important to talk here about the song by BTS, or by August D and RM, Strange. And why I find this song so wonderful is that a lot of the time people tend to blame it on the individual, It's, this person is wrong, this person is evil, this person doesn't know what they're talking about, they're trying to do these horrible things. And yes, that is true, but that doesn't really fix the problem if you see it that way. And so Strange looks at the higher problem of where this is coming from, where the root of this is. And it's the same with this society of Omelas, is that we are told that this is the way it has to be. So what can we do about that? How can we justify that? How can we live with that? This is the things that we can do. We can tell ourselves these lies. We can tell ourselves that this is the case. And that way we're able to be okay. We're able to live with it. We're able to assuage our guilt, I suppose. And so in the song Strange, it says, we're given multiple choices and our taste is controlled by the capital. And there's a lot more in this song, but this was the one thing that I wanted to talk about, because that is the case of the matter, is that you are told, okay, this is how it goes, and you have A, B, C, or D. You choose. You make the decision. When in reality, there shouldn't be multiple choices to begin with. It shouldn't be restricted in this way. It should be something that you can think freely about, that you can make your own mind up about. But it's like, whatever your taste is, it's controlled. Everything that you think you know, everything that you think that you like, dislike, it's all something that was a multiple choice question given to you. And a text like this, like Omelas, is something that's saying, don't just settle for the multiple choices. Write in the margins. Write something underneath. say, I don't want your A, B or C questions, because my mind doesn't work like that, like start thinking of things differently.
Hi, this is Editing Billie, and I just wanted to make a point because while I was watching this, I don't specifically make it clear in the video, but most of the stuff I'm talking about is understanding difference and understanding those who come from maybe a background or an environment that is separate to your own, and like how people try to understand and empathize, or how they neglect and dehumanize those from different groups from them. But something to note here is, if you are a member of this group, if you are a member of those who are marginalized, who are being oppressed, or who are being, exploited, dehumanized, then it's very different. It's a very different way that we would look at it. And like, you can't just be ignorant of these things because it's your everyday life. It's not the case where you go through and then society suppresses you from seeing things outside of your perspective, and eventually maybe you open your eyes and you start to see things like it talks about in Strange. Like, you have your eyes open from birth, from the beginning, because you are the person who faces this discrimination, and you can't ignore it. You can't pretend it's not there because it affects you every day. And so I wanted to just make that point, because it's not as straightforward as I'm explaining it here for those people who are the ones suffering, and for those people who live this life every day. This is more just about, take Omelas for an example. The perspective is from the outside, from like the people, the citizens in Omelas, those who don't live the life of the child, those who maybe are trying to process it. So we're looking at it from that angle, but I just wanted to make sure that I'm not dismissing the fact that it's not the case for those whose experiences are like this every day.
So I kind of thought a little bit to myself about what is it that make people come up with these justifications. And there are many, but some of the ones that I came up with are, number one, self-preservation and selfishness. This idea that if I do anything to help others, then that will destroy my own happiness, my own health, my own fortune. So, this, we can talk about privilege here. This idea of white people, maybe for an example, saying, we don't want to help others because then it's taking away from our resources. Forgetting the fact that the resources are very unevenly spread anyway, but this is just one example. Self-preservation. Another example, if we make the rules of believing women who have been involved with sexual violence more open, then we are putting ourselves under threat, because then women can lie and we can be punished for something we didn't do. So it's like, we're fine with what happens, we're fine with the victim blaming, and we aren't going to change anything about it, or at least we're just not going to think about it, we're not going to talk about it, because that preserves our own ability to not be living in fear. So, number two, an inability to imagine an alternative. And there's this really, really famous quote in academia which goes along the lines of, it is now easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And it's because this has been done in a way where capitalism and neoliberal capitalism, which we'll talk about a bit more later, has permeated the culture so deeply that it has kind of become a part of who we are, that we don't even know. And obviously this is different in different countries because there's different methods, but in the Western world, the majority of the Western world, it's this idea that we've been told that there's not even anything else, there's nothing else possible, this is the way that it is, and we're just accepting of this being the way that it is, and this is how it has to be. And this also links back to that anti-utopian rhetoric that's been very prominent, in that, it's impossible for us to now think of something better because we're afraid of that. We're afraid of thinking better because of what happened before, and we don't want to think of a utopia. We don't want to think of a perfect world. So it's easier to just accept the reality of the situation and not make any changes and try to live with it from within that system. And so now it's like I can imagine dystopia and the end of the world and the apocalypse and natural disasters and nuclear bombs blowing everything up. I can imagine that before I can imagine the end of capitalism. And so, this is something that people also do, why they don't make a change in this society, why people start making justifications for this society, is because of the inability to see anything else. Number 3, powerlessness, and we've gone over this a little bit. With the youth, with certain people from marginalised groups, maybe they don't feel like they have a voice, feel like they're not going to be able to contribute anything. They don't have the resources to be able to contribute anything. They want to be able to help like the young people in this society, but they feel like there's nothing that they can do about it. So they have to justify it to themselves. Number 4, willful ignorance. We have this in terms of the people that don't even go to look at the child. They just think, oh, okay, I know about it. Like, it's there. Okay, I'll live my life. We do this a lot with child workers and slave labour abroad in other countries that make our clothing, that make our food and our phones and technology. And we and with the meat industry, with animals and those factories, and we're kind of willfully ignorant of those things of like, okay, yeah, we kind of know this is happening, but that's really going to like affect me if I think about it. So I'm going to just pretend it doesn't exist and continue living. And that's how I justify it to myself, because maybe this combines with another one. I don't feel like I can do anything about it, or my life will be worse if I do something about it. So I'm just going to pretend it's not there. Number 5, exploitation. And like, it's important to talk about the fact that there are some members of society, there are some big corporations, there are some, people right at the top of the food chain who just want to exploit others for their own personal greed, for their own personal gain. It's like we enjoy exploiting other people and we don't care about it. We think this is our nature and law of the jungle, and we will do that, and that's how we justify it. And number 6 that I have written down here, and this is the last one, is superiority. This idea of dehumanization, once again, of I'm better than you, so I can do what I want to you. It's my right as the superior race. We have white superiority, which is very prevalent around the world, of our race is the superior race, so we are entitled to these things. And, that's another way that people might justify this behavior to themselves. So this is our final quote, and this is how the this is how the short story ends. This is the final paragraph. At times, one of the adolescent girls or boys who go to see the child does not go home to weep or rage, does not, in fact, go home at all. Sometimes also a man or woman much older falls silent for a day or two, and then leaves home. Each alone, they go west or north towards the mountains. They go on. They leave Omelas. They walk ahead into the darkness, and they do not come back. The place they go towards is a place even less imaginable to most of us than the city of happiness. I cannot describe it at all. It is possible that it does not exist, but they seem to know where they're going, the ones who walk away from Omelas. It's so powerful. Like, I'm pretty sure every time I've read it, my eyes have started to water every time. So here we have another response, a different kind of a response than the first one. And we have those that decide that they cannot accept this reality. They cannot go back to living in this world, and they just need to leave it behind. And it talks about, some of the adolescents, some of the young people, but sometimes also people older, sometimes men or women that are of an older age. They all kind of come to this realization inside, and we're not told what it is. And I think that's important, and that's the point, is because it makes you wonder, I wonder what it was that they thought in their silence, and when they go alone, if they were afraid, what they thought about it, and where they were heading, And this again reminds me of the song Strange, and it's that argument of Jungi talks first about how isn't it strange that the ones that have their eyes open in a world that has their eyes closed is treated as a mutant. And Namjoon responds later that it's not strange to me that those with their eyes open in a world with their eyes closed is treated as a mutant. It's more strange that they opened their eyes in the first place, because the society a lot of the time doesn't allow you for the chance to open your eyes. And to be able to open your eyes is a sort of enlightenment that requires real independence of thought, real bravery. And they walk towards the darkness, to something that is away from this happy society that they know. And they go into this place which is described as unimaginable, more unimaginable than the city of happiness, because the city of happiness is our city. Like, it might not be this utopia, it might not be this perfect world, but it's meant to be something that you've created, that you live in, that you are the same as the people in it. But the place where you walk away from this, that's something that hasn't been done. That's the road not taken. Like BTS once more, going ahead, forging something that has not been done before. It's scary. It takes bravery. And people that haven't done it themselves can't understand it. But the point is that they seem to know where they're going. And it's this idea of clarity, enlightenment. That's what I would say these people have developed, and why they leave. Because they have this understanding that it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be the way that they have told me it has to be, and I can have my own individual freedom in the choices that I make. Now, it does not talk anywhere in the text about the idea of fighting against the existing system, and I think that that's important too, and we'll talk about that in a bit, but yeah. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is just a couple of her other works, Ursula K. Guin, that link to this story. So, like I said, we don't really get a resolve of, what happens to the ones who walk away from Omelas. It's not explained, it's not described, but this story here, The Day Before the Revolution, is another short story that is put into a collection with the ones who walk away from Omelas, and it is prefaced as saying that it is a story about one of the ones who walked away from Omelas. So we do kind of get one idea of maybe where one of them went, what happened to them. And so the story itself is a telling of an old lady coming to the end of her life, and she is kind of talking about her ideas and her thoughts and her influence. And so because of her, a movement was able to be sparked that would kind of allow for the creation of a new and a better world. And so this story is about, just before this has happened, and how she's kind of passing on her wisdom and her ideas to the younger generation, and realizing it's not a place for her anymore, it's a place for the youth to continue on this legacy and create something better. And so the idea is that one of those people that walked away from Omelas was able to be innovative, was able to come up with something new that wasn't presented to her within the city of Omelas, was outside of the multiple choice question. And so that's what this story is about. And then we go on to The Dispossessed, which is one of her novels. It's a utopian novel. It's fantastic. I really recommend it. But this is about the society that was formed because of The Day Before the Revolution. So that lady walked away from Omelas and spent her life thinking about a new movement and new ideas, and eventually those ideas were fulfilled in this book, The Dispossessed. And she's not in it, but it's kind of in the future where it's all like created and everything. And the story is set on two twin planets, and these twin planets kind of want to learn about each other because they're very different from one another. And we have one planet which is based on this kind of anarchistic rule of Odo, who was the lady's name. It's based on her principles and her movement. It doesn't have an organised government. It's built on community and on freedom and on kind of respect for others, rather than having rules and it all being defined. That's kind of what anarchism is. And the other planet is run by two opposing governments. And we have one which is based very heavily on the US, and it's a kind of capitalist, patriarchal system of governing, and the other one is based on the USSR and is a very authoritarian way of governing. And Le Guin has stated that this was kind of like influenced by the Vietnam War, which was all about the clashing of those opposing ways of governing, of capitalism, communism. And what I think is really fascinating in this as well is how it links to Korean history as well. And I don't know if the members or if Bang PD or whoever has read into these texts as well as the ones who walk away from Omelas. But it's really fascinating to me because I don't know if you know much about Korean history, but basically Korea used to be unified, used to be one country, and then during the Second World War, the north half of Korea was occupied by the USSR and the south half of Korea by the US. And so it was already kind of split like this, and there was a line put in the middle. Now, these kind of imposing countries then left it like that, and eventually the north half of the country invaded down into the south half of the country again, and the US, being afraid of the spread of communism, came back over and pushed them back up to the north, and it started the Korean War, which happened in the 50s. And so this was where, you know, we had these two opposing sides fighting on Korean soil in what used to be their own one unified country. And so what happened in the end was that the US and the USSR agreed to an armistice. They didn't want to fight anymore, and they just thought, you know, let's just call it a day, put this line in, and say we're not going to fight each other, we'll have a ceasefire. And that has still continued up until this very day. And that is why a lot of Koreans talk about unification and the want of joining the country back together, because it was split apart into two opposing nations, and that is kind of how the two countries have become what they were today. So again, I think it's really interesting when you think about this novel here and how it is based on this idea of these two opposing governments and something that's an alternative to that. So yeah, that was just something I found really fascinating, and I wonder if whoever looked into Guin from BTS or their team had thought about it in that way as well. So the novel shows kind of positives and negatives for both. It's not just a this bad, this good. It's a thorough explanation of it, but it's this idea of utopianism, of finding something different, this new form of utopianism, of thinking of something outside the box, thinking of something better than the multiple choice question that we're given. So what I want to leave this on when we move away from Omelas as a text is just some questions to consider. And like I've said before, like I feel like this text is very much set up in a way that actively doesn't provide you with answers to things, so that it can encourage you to think outside of the box and to think of your own answers to questions. And so while I was reading this text, I had a lot of thoughts and I had a lot of questions that I would ask the narrator, that I would ask about this world that it hasn't told me. And so I wanted to share those with you. So some of them were, why is the suffering of the child even necessary? Why does this child have to suffer for the happiness of the city? It has no correlation to one another. Like, it's not like this has to happen in order for this to happen because you can see that. It's like somebody's just said that this is the way that it is. Oh, in order for this city to be happy, this child has to suffer. What would happen if the child didn't suffer? Would there be an earthquake? Would people come in and as like a military guard and kill everyone? Like, what are the conditions? Why is this necessary? What difference does it make? So the next question is, who controls this narrative that it is necessary, and why do the characters and the narrators believe it? Who tells us that this is necessary? How do you find out that this has to happen this way? Is it a government? Is it your parents? Is it an outside force from the society, from somewhere else? Who tells us this? And the characters, none of them question it. None of them say, well, why does it have to be that way? Why can't we just open this door and let this child go? Nobody does that, not even the narrator. So why do they believe it? What has happened that has made them think that this is necessary? That's something that I find fascinating. Why is there no mention of an attempt to rescue the child? So like I said, we have mentions of people justifying things and continuing to live there. We have people who decide that they can't justify this and they can't live there anymore and they walk away from Omelas. But why is there no talk of a rebellion, of a revolt, a social movement that, oh, we cannot abide by this, and any society that is ruled like this and is treating somebody like this, we aren't accepting. We're not doing this. We're going to change this system. There's no talk of that. And that again brings me back to this idea that it seems like everyone truly believes this and thinks that in order to free this child, they are going to be causing like the suffering of all of the other people in society. But I find that interesting is that there's no discussion of we want to help this child, or well, there's discussion of we want to help this child, but there's no discussion of we will help this child. So why does nobody question the legitimacy or discredit the system? It kind of talks about the same kind of themes. Is there an alternative? Is it possible? What would it be? When was this trade created? When was it first created? When did this first come into being? Was it recently? Was it a long time ago? How long has this been happening for? I mean, it seems like a while because you've had like different youth coming in to see it and things like that. So when was this created? By who was it created? Who sat down and said, this is the way it has to be, we will agree, we won't agree? How is the child chosen? How do we define which child is the one to suffer? Is it somebody from the city themselves that's chosen randomly? Is it a child from somewhere else? How do you decide which child it's going to be? Does this child get replaced when it's no longer a child by a new child, a different child? Is this child a child forever? Does it just not grow? Does it stay the same? Or when it gets older, does something happen to it? What happens to it? And do we have a new child come in? And again, where are they chosen from, if so? What happened to its mother? I didn't explain this before, but in the text we learn that this child did have a mother. So what happened to that mother? Was this child taken away forcibly? Did this mother die? I mean, you would think that she would not allow this to happen, because would it change if it was your own child? Like, maybe you could accept this happening, but then if somebody came to your door and said, we're taking your child to implement this system, would that be different? So there's just a lot of things that I was thinking when I was reading through this text, and that made me question things, because, and this is exactly what it wants you to do, I think, because it wants you to do that within your own society. A lot of the time we just walk through life and we don't really think about things that aren't just in front of our nose. It's like, oh, this is how it's always been. This is how I was brought up to think. This is normality. It's become just natural. But texts like these and literature, in a lot of cases, is a way of you to expand your mind and think, what am I not being told? What is being held back from me? What are people trying to make me believe? What are they trying to hide? What lies are they coming up with? And so this text is a way of kind of saying, well, if I'm thinking about all these questions here, how can I apply that to my own society? How can I apply that to my own feelings on different instances where this happens in real life? Because it does happen in real life. There are people suffering to provide happiness for others, and the intent, I think, is to make us start to think about that a little bit deeper, and to think of all these questions that are not answered, that we just kind of accept, just as the way the characters do. Okay, so we're going to go on to moral and ethics theory now. Okay, so I wanted to talk about moral philosophy because this story, as I've said, is often used in classes as a way of kind of exploring moral philosophy. And so we'll go into it a bit more. Like, moral philosophy is kind of the study of like what's wrong, what's right, what should we do, how do we decide it, blah, blah, blah. So what is moral philosophy? Okay, so it's the study of like three main questions. Number one is, why should we want to act morally? So what makes us motivated to behave morally, and why would we want to? And, you know, this can be for many reasons, and the main things that is kind of discussed in this section is it for like a self-interest? Is that, whether that be in terms of because you want to boost your reputation, because you want to be seen as a good person, because you want to get more money, because you want to feel good about yourself because it's inside the soul and you feel like it's kind of like you're behaving in a way that's just? Is there something inherent within us that wants us to behave morally? Or is it related to society? Is it because we want society to run stably? Is it because we want other people to be treated fairly? Is it because it makes things easier to run? I mean, our society is kind of built in a way that rewards acting morally and punishes when you act immorally. So if you act morally, then you're seen as a better person, you might have better opportunities, more friends. And if you behave immorally, you might be punished, you might be sent to prison, you might get fired from your job, you might lose friendships and things like that. So yeah, the first question is, why should we want to act morally? What motivates us to behave in a way that's considered moral? Now, the second question is, what does it entail to act morally? What is considered being moral? And this changes depending on your context, depending on who you are as a person, what you value, what your family has taught you to value, what is considered rude, what is considered not rude, whether we should protect children, whether we should protect the elderly, whether we should help those in need, those who are vulnerable. What does it mean to behave morally? What is considered moral and what is considered immoral? And also, what can we make permissible? What is something that we can accept that maybe isn't considered a moral thing, but in this circumstance it's okay? What can we justify? Think of euthanasia, capital punishment. I mean, like, killing is something widely considered as an immoral act, but if it's euthanasia because somebody doesn't want to live because they're suffering, is that something that we can accept? Is capital punishment, is the killing of people who've committed crimes, is that something that we can accept and think is morally permissible? So what does it entail? What does it mean to be moral? What does it mean to be immoral? And how is that defined? That's question 3. How do we define what is moral? Who decides what is moral? What influences us to think this is moral, this is immoral? This might be the government. This might be our culture. This might be what's considered in certain ways to be rude, in other ways to be not rude. If we think of career as an example, it's considered moral and right to behave in a way that's respectful to elders, whereas in like my culture it's considered moral to treat other people who deserve it in a good way. And if you are older but you haven't earned the respect, or you've done something that people perceive as wrong, then you don't have to behave morally to that person, So how do we define what is moral? So the study of philosophy is a way of kind of theorizing what these things mean, and it's very complicated because, like I say, the parameters change depending on how you are looking at the topic, depending on the person, depending on where they are in the world, and depending on all of these different types of things. So that's kind of a basic overview of what moral philosophy is. So we're going to talk mainly about Western ethical thought and, what are the main areas that we study in Western ethical thought? What are the main kind of factors and categories that we can structure in a way that we understand what ethical thought is and what the study of it is? So the first thing I want to talk about is intrinsic value versus instrumental value. And so intrinsic value is like what we are, who we are, what we're worth as a person, that kind of thing. And it's like, so if you're a human being, you have human rights. You deserve to be treated in a certain way simply because of who you are and what you are. And then instrumental value is what you provide. So those are kind of like these two things that are like important to consider in terms of ethical thought. So there are kind of 3 main areas in Western ethical thought. There are a lot of different things, but I'm just kind of simplifying it down to these 3 different areas. And the first one is virtue theory. So virtue theory, this kind of became popular quite a long time ago with Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, these kind of Greek theorists that have been around for a long, long time. You might have heard of them. And the idea of virtue theory is a theory which emphasizes the virtues or moral character. So the main thing that this kind of pertains to is, if you are a good person, then your actions will be moral. If you are a bad person, then your actions will be immoral. So it emphasizes the person as a whole. So if you are given a thought experiment, for example, if you're a good person, then you will show a moral act. And if you are a bad person, you will show an immoral act. So that's kind of how virtue theory decides on what morality means. Now, the deontological tradition. So this was made famous by Immanuel Kant, and this is kind of an ethics code, as we've got in this picture here. So it's a theory which regards which choices are morally required, forbidden, or permitted. So this focuses on the act itself, and if you act in a way that is considered moral in your cultural background, in the rules that are kind of set out for you of your society, of what is considered moral and what is considered like forbidden, you're not allowed to do this, the act itself is the thing that is focused on. And it's, if you are a great person but you do something that is considered immoral, then that is immoral. And if you are a bad person but you do something good, then that is considered moral, because it's all about the choices that you made and if you stick to this kind of code. Consequentialism. So this is a theory which embodies the basic intuition that what is best or right is whatever makes the world best in the future. So this looks at the consequences of the actions, not the act itself, but what the act will result in the future. And this is for like the whole basis of humanity. You can't just put it on yourself. It can't be like, oh, if I kick this kid over and take his ice cream, then that results in happiness for me, yay. But it's not like that. So it's what will be the future repercussions, the future results for humanity as a whole, and whether it is good or bad is how the outcome will happen. And an example, a branch of consequentialism, is utilitarianism. And this is the main one that we're going to focus on today, because this is what the story of Omelas kind of looks into. And the main theorists of these that started this tradition is John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. So let's look at utilitarianism. So according to the happiness principle from John Stuart Mill, actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. So the most happiness that you can create is something which is good. So morality is defined by how much happiness or just positivity or good can be given to the most amount of people. And if it produces the reverse of happiness for the most amount of people, then that means that it's an immoral thing. So Omelas, if we look at it, it's one person's unhappiness for the entirety of the population's happiness. And so according to utilitarianism, this consequence of this action is that a huge amount of people will benefit from this system and one person will not benefit from this system. So in regards to utilitarianism, this kind of justifies this as a moral act. Allowing this child to continue in this place is moral because it protects the happiness of all of the others around them. So to summarize and put in simple terms, number one, virtue theory focuses on the actor, the person who is committing the act, and what their motivations are and why they do so. Number two, the deontological tradition focuses on the act itself, whether this act is right or wrong in accordance to the rules of that ethical society, or you know what I mean. And number three, the consequentialism is focusing on the consequences of that action. So what happens next, what comes afterwards, and if it promotes happiness or good for the majority of people. So how can we put utilitarianism into perspective? As we've seen in terms of the story Omelas, it's this idea that if one person, one child has to suffer, then it's permissible because it results in the happiness and the prosperity of a lot of other people. So that's one example, and we'll talk about some more. So the first one, the trolley problem. This is another thought experiment that we talked about earlier, and a lot of you might have heard of this. It's very famous, but just indulge me. So I'll read it out to you. Okay. A runaway trolley is heading down the tracks towards 5 workers who will all be killed if the trolley proceeds on its present course. Adam is standing next to a large switch that can divert the trolley onto a different track. The only way to save the lives of the 5 workers is to divert the trolley onto another track that only has 1 worker on it. If Adam diverts the trolley onto the other track, this 1 worker will die, but the other 5 workers will be saved. So this is a thought experiment that looks into the concept of utilitarianism. And according to utilitarianism, when you have 5 people on one track and 1 person on another track, the moral thing would be that Adam is required to pull this lever and take the life of 1 over 5. And so that promotes the most good for the most amount of people. This thought experiment is asking you what you would do in this situation. And it's interesting because the thing is that Adam would have to actively participate in what's happening in order to save those lives. And so would he then be killing that one person when the trolley was already on its course and was going to take the lives of 5? Does this mean that his act is moral or his act is immoral? Because he's taking a life, but he's saving lives. It's difficult to define. What do you think? What do you think is moral in this situation? Would you pull the lever? Would you not? How would you justify this? Which would you think would be the moral decision in this circumstance? So let's change the parameters now. A runaway trolley is heading down the tracks towards 5 workers who will all be killed if the trolley proceeds on its present course. Adam is on a footbridge over the tracks in between the approaching trolley and the 5 workers. Next to him on this footbridge is a stranger who happens to be very large. The only way to save the lives of the 5 workers is to push this stranger off the footbridge and onto the tracks below, where his large body will stop the trolley. The stranger will die if Adam does this, but the 5 workers will be saved. Now, with these changed parameters, does that change anything about this situation? It's still 1 life in exchange for 5. And so, like in utilitarianism, saving the most lives is considered to be moral, and the consequence of this action would be that 5 is saved and 1 is killed. But Adam now has to take an even more active role in this situation. He has to personally push a stranger in front of the oncoming train so that he can save others. Is this considered murder? Is this considered saving them? Is this moral? Is this immoral? Could you do this? How would you justify it? It kind of changes the parameters again, and it makes us question of what is moral, because the thing is, this would be considered murder. Now, if we think about it in terms of the deontological tradition, this act is actively murdering a person. So that act is not something which is moral. So how would you combat this option? And so this is just one of the thought experiments that we can do. And we can also change the parameters a bit more to question ourselves. What if the one person on that track was a child? What if it was a family member of ours? How would that change our response to this situation? Or what if the 5 members on the tracks were all convicted criminals? Would that change our decision? Would that make us feel less guilty about it? How does that change morality? How can we define morality in these circumstances? Okay, let's move on to another one. Jim and the Indians. This is another thought experiment. So Jim comes upon a group of Indians held at gunpoint by soldiers who plan to kill them to set an example. Jim is given a choice: kill 1 Indian and the others will live, or refuse and all will be killed. Now again, in terms of utilitarianism, it's 1 life to save 19, but you will have to be an active participant in the murdering of an individual. Is this moral? Is this immoral? Why? How can we look outside of the parameters of what is being given to us and create a new outcome, something that doesn't require any of these lives to be lost? It's just another thought experiment, so something to think about in terms of this and in terms of utilitarianism. And again, we can link this back to Omelas. So, would you allow the suffering of this one child to save others? If you would, why? If you wouldn't, why? What makes it moral? What makes it immoral? Now, let's talk about Peter Singer, who is a moral philosopher. And so here's a quote from Peter Singer. He says, "The failure of people in the rich nations to make any significant sacrifices in order to assist people who are dying from poverty-related causes is ethically indefensible." So this is his argument. If you are living in or in control of a country who has access to a lot of wealth and you refuse or just neglect to help those from a poverty-ridden country, then he argues that this is ethically wrong. You cannot justify this. So what do you take of this? Do you think this is accurate? Can you see how this relates to Omelas? Like, it's different because it's a wider amount of people. There are more people at risk here, but it's this idea that in order for one utopia to be possible, or in order for some people to be living in, say, first world countries, and the child representing the people who are living in poverty. So that's another one to think about. Now, I wanted to talk a bit about marginalized groups, and so We can kind of place marginalised groups in the position of the child, and so it's very commonly known that quality of life and basic human rights are often denied or unequally spread when one belongs to a marginalised group, including those pertaining to race, gender, sexuality, class, age, nationality, disability, and there are more. These are just the ones that I've kind of put on the screen here. And so when we think of morality, is it required of us to help those from marginalised groups? Is it morally required of us to provide assistance to them to make sure that there's an equality? And so I wanted to just highlight some different facts and figures about marginalised groups in our society. So this is a survey of consumer finances in the US, and it is about the racial wealth divide and how that has changed over 3 decades. We have 1989 to 2019, and you can see in the first category, this is all of the kind of growth in wealth over that period of time. This is the amount of wealth for white people. This is the amount of wealth for black people. This is the amount of wealth for Latino people. And this is the median wealth by race. So you can see in this image that the racial wealth divide is very significant. It's huge, and it hasn't really changed much over time. And so this is the idea that can some people's utopia, can the growth of wealth and economic finances for white be morally justified when you look at it in relation to black and Latino and other races as well? This is somebody's version of happiness, somebody's version of utopia on the basis of the suffering of those from marginalised groups. So next we have a study, and this is from the UK. This is from a newspaper article that I found, and it talked about how the richest 1% of society have almost a quarter of UK wealth, the study claims. Now there's a major problem of class divide and wealth division within the UK, and so again, when we think about this, is this right? Is this morally justified? Is it okay that there are 1% of people that have almost a quarter of UK wealth when there are millions of people living in poverty all over the UK? How can we justify this? How can we make this as a morally permissible thing? And if it's not a morally permissible thing, what can be done about it? Why is this continuing? Why is this persisting within our society? Why aren't we changing it? Why aren't those at the top changing it, the government? What's being done about it? And finally, another fact we have here is about gender inequality in the EU. So it says at the bottom here that women constitute over half of our population within the EU. But then we have some facts and figures here. Women earn 16% less than men on average. The gender pension gap is 39%. 1 out of 3 women experienced at least one form of sexist or sexual violence in the past 12 months. 56% is the total proportion of women who are a victim of street harassment at least once in their life. Think of the Me Too movement. And this final one here is talking about how much time men versus women spend on daily cooking and housework, and versus how much time they spend participating in sporting or cultural leisure activities outside of the home. So again, we can think about how the society has been built on patriarchal values and why women are the ones who bear the brunt of this inequality and suffering, and they are from the marginalised groups. So again, this represents this idea of the child in the basement, the people who are suffering, as the expense for those who receive more goods, more happiness, more safety, things like that. So yeah, these are all just interesting things to think about when we think about what is morality and how this story of Omelas can be related to these types of instances of marginalised groups, how we can relate it to our own society and think, what are the people who are suffering in order to provide for other groups of people, and is this okay, and what can be done about it? So I wanted to talk a bit about neoliberalism here, and we talked about this before. So neoliberalism came about, I think it was in the 1980s, and it was kind of this idea of changing the way society is run. There's a quote by Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of the UK at that time, saying that something like the object is to change the heart and soul of humanity. And the point was that we should take away control from the government and from politics and put it in the hands of economics. Because if we let economics rule our societies, then that's a better way of being. That's the kind of basic premise. So this first quote here: neoliberalism's premise is that free markets can regulate themselves, that government is inherently incompetent, captive to special interests, and an intrusion on the efficiency of the market, that in distributive terms, market outcomes are basically deserved, and that redistribution creates perverse incentives by punishing the economy's winners and rewarding its losers. So government should get out of the market's way. So the idea that is often said, and this word distribution is commented upon a lot, is the idea that if we allow people to focus on their individual selves, on their individual wealth and growing that in terms of our society, then this wealth will eventually reward people who deserve to be rewarded and punish people who don't do enough to be rewarded. So it's basically saying that it's unfair for the society to redistribute wealth and opportunities and things like this, because that just punishes the people who try the hardest. And I mean, I hate neoliberalism. I think it's just the most ridiculous thing, and all that it really does is rewards those who are at the very top of the hierarchy. So let's think about it for a second. It's saying that if you try hard enough and if you deserve to be rewarded in this economy, then your wealth should not be redistributed. It should not be taken from you because you've earned it and you have a right to it. Now, if we think about society and how privilege is filtered throughout it, as we just looked at, if you come from a background where you have no finances to start a business and you have to work at a supermarket just to be able to make sure that you have food and that you have a roof over your head, how are you then going to be able to join the economic market? What it really does, and what we have seen it to do, is spread the wealth even further and make the divide even greater within society. And I mean, I see this in my country, you can see it in the US, you can see it in Korea. The divide has just gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And the way that this is often excused, and I see it all the time in political campaigns and things like that, is just, if you try harder, if you work hard enough, then the system will reward you. And a lot of people believed this at first. I think of my granddad, who thought Margaret Thatcher was great because it was like, well, if I am a hardworking man and I go to work every single day, then I will be able to earn enough money to provide for my family, to get what I need, and that's great. But as I said, opportunities are not equal. Some people are born with a whole empire around them that they inherit just because they were born into that family. And a government like this, which doesn't distribute things equally to others so that they also have the opportunities to do so, just makes this divide even greater, makes those at the very top live their best lives, get everything that they want, and those who are at the bottom never have the chance to grow. And you know, you're often fed this idea of the American dream, of the self-made man, but when you really think about it, it doesn't usually happen that way. It's a very unfair way of governing society. And so neoliberalism kind of changed the idea of cooperation with others, helping others, behaving morally and having moral duties and obligations to others who aren't as fortunate as you, to saying, now we are competition against others. My neighbour is not my friend. I have to work against him to be able to succeed in life. And BTS talks about this a lot. Think about No. Think about how they talk about this system makes us compete with our closest friends. We have to stand on top of them in order to win. We have to be number one or we're a failure. And that's what this system is teaching us. And because of that, we have to work ourselves to the bone. Or think about Bepse when it talks about the generational divide and how, just try harder. We were never given a chance to begin with because we had short legs and you had long legs. You were born with everything. How can you say that this is fair? How can you say that this is my fault because I'm not doing enough. And so this idea of neoliberalism. It's very, very prevalent in our culture. A lot of people think that this is the way that it is, but it has been changing recently as things have been exposed and people have been saying this isn't enough. We don't like how this is working out. We can see through it. And all those people who are at the very top are the only ones who are rewarded from this system. Now, at this bottom left, we've got this quote. Neoliberalism sees competition as the defining characteristic of human relations. It redefines citizens as consumers whose democratic choices are best exercised by buying and selling, a process that rewards merit and punishes inefficiency. So we're not just human beings anymore. It's not about our intrinsic value that means that we deserve a right to happiness, to wealth, to opportunities. It is about what we're worth, what our value is, what we can provide. And instead of being a human being, we are simply a consumer. We are constantly taught that we have to lose weight to become desirable in this society, or look a certain way to become desirable. We have to work all the time so that we can increase our stock value. And that's kind of what it's become, is that each human person is a stock. And you work your whole life to improve your own stock so that you can be seen as worthy, so that you can be rewarded. But the system that we have in neoliberalism doesn't actually reward those who do those things. It might for some, it might make things better for some, but it's just still very unequally distributed. And this final quote, inequality is recast as virtuous, a reward for utility and a generator of wealth, which trickles down to enrich everyone. Efforts to create a more equal society are both counterproductive and morally corrosive. The market ensures that everyone gets what they deserve. So we shouldn't be focusing on politics because inequality is there for a reason. It's there because people who provide for the market, people who provide for the economy, they will be rewarded, and eventually that wealth will trickle down to their workers. If they have a big corporation, they will earn loads and loads of money, and then they'll be able to employ more workers, and those workers will be able to employ more workers. And if you work hard enough, then you will be able to be rewarded for your actions. And if you decide that you don't want to work, then that means that you get punished for that because you're not allowed the same values as us. But again, think of this in terms of our society, in terms of women are automatically paid less than men in a lot of cases. So that's already something which is, the system is against this marginalized group. Race. If you think back to when the white community started earning money, it's so long ago. Whereas black people only had their freedom from slavery, and I'm referring to the US in general here, not very long ago. So how can it be considered equal when one person has had opportunities right from the beginning that has passed down through generation, and then others are supposed to start from 500 meters behind the line, and they're supposed to be rewarded if they work hard enough? It's not equal, it's not fair, and it doesn't trickle down into society. It actually just punishes those who are from marginalized groups. And this is all considered these days as morality by a lot of people, is that if you work hard enough, you get what you need, stop complaining, just work harder. It's very frustrating. Now let's talk about the chaebols in South Korea. Now you might have heard this term from K-dramas. You know, there's often chaebols in K-dramas. They're the heir to a big company, and everybody wants to know them, and they have everything, and they have wealth and power, and so it's quite a prevalent staple of South Korean society. And now what's really interesting about chaebols, and this refers to capitalism as well as a whole. So when it was first introduced, it was useful in society. I mean, if we think about chaebols, South Korea is known for having a rapidly growing economic global standing. And so after the Second World War, they enhanced their status and their economic income globally because of the influence of these chaebols. So the government invested a lot of money in certain owned family conglomerates where they would say, you produce technology, you produce ships, and we will give you a lot of money, and in order to do so, we have to become the best in our field, and this will grow and boost our economy. And it did happen that way, and because it was passed down from family to family to family, the people who owned them had more of a stake in their success, and this has happened, and over the years they have grown and grown and grown to the point where the top 10 in South Korea now equate to more than 27% of all business assets in Korea. And now you have to think, if they weren't there, or if we tried to redistribute the wealth, would that cause a complete economic crash? I mean, this has happened before. Like, there are big economic crashes because a lot of the time economies rely on these big businesses, rely on these big companies to be able to keep them stable and to help those who are further down, the workers and all those types of things. And that's the main premise of this. And so there are positives to capitalism, but capitalism morphed into neoliberalism, and this is where the real problems began. And it also causes a big generation divide, because the people who grew up with these chaebols coming into business and seeing the progress of it and benefiting from it and being able to raise their own standings in society, they believe in it. However, the younger generation, those that came later, those who were from oppressed groups, it got worse and worse and worse for them, to the point where they were the sacrifices of this society. And I think again of Bepse and BTS's criticism and commentary on this way of the society operating. It's, you took everything. You already took everything from us, and now you have the audacity to tell us that it's our fault, that we need to try harder, that we need to work harder. We don't have a chance because of you. And so this has been happening all over the world recently, where those who are poor are getting poorer, though there aren't opportunities available, and those who are rich are getting richer, and people are starting to question this and think this is wrong, this is not morally acceptable. So what do you think? Do you think this can be justified? Do you think that it's necessary to be able to keep the economy stable? Do you see the people who are the expense, who are the child in the basement from Omelas, who are the ones who are suffering as a result of this way of generating wealth and happiness in society for those at the top of the hierarchy? Now, I've brought all of this into play because this is how BTS themselves use this story within their own social commentary. And we'll go on to talk about that now. So the next element that we're going to be talking about is BTS's use of this text, how they use this idea of moral philosophy in their Spring Day music video, and how this relates to the Sewol Ferry Tragedy that happened in South Korea. Okay, so first we're going to look into some possible interpretations of BTS's use of this story and the music video, and then we're going to look into the Sewol Ferry Tragedy in a little bit more detail and talk about why they spoke about this, what happened, and why it was such a tragedy in South Korean history. We're going to go on to talk about South Korea's social movements. They're really famous for their social movements. And then the Hillsborough disaster, which is another disaster that happened in the UK that is very similar to the Sewol Ferry Tragedy, and that BTS also utilised in their social commentary, before finally just making a few comments on the film Snowpiercer, another art piece that they've used within their music video. So, interpretations of this music video. Now, I think what's so fantastic about this music video is that there are so many ways to interpret this music video. There are so many ways to view it, to think about it. There's a lot of subtleties painted in it. And the song itself, I mean, we've had Guin, I think it was Guin, recently confirm that this was to do with the Sewol Ferry Tragedy, but it's also to do with loss and longing, and it's about grief and missing people. So there are a lot of different things filtered throughout this music video, but I think it's very, very clear that it is a social commentary talking about injustice, and particularly the Sewol Ferry Tragedy, because of their use of imagery, because of their personal support of the families, because of their criticism of the government at this time, and because of their other body of work, and just the choices that they made of what to use within this music video and this song. So one of the main things I've noticed within this music video and this song is that there are a lot of dichotomies. There are a lot of this versus this, and, you know, opposites that are being used. So we have kind of utopia, dystopia, happiness, sadness, pain, joy, hope, desperation, all of these types of things within this music video. And it's very powerful. It's a way of kind of saying, this is wrong, we're exposing this, but don't lose hope. If you are from this group of people, we have to stand together. We can't lose hope. We can hope for something better. We won't be anti-utopian. We won't settle for what they have given us, the constructs that they have put us into. We will instead think of a better world for the future and hope to get there. And so when I think of this music video, my personal interpretation is that we have JK representing the child within Omelas. Now, if you think through this music video, JK is kind of left alone a lot, and when he goes through Omelas, it's empty, it's deserted, and we have him in front of this carousel that says "You Never Walk Alone," which we'll go on to discuss, that has the yellow ribbons on it, and that also, if you see in this bottom right picture, looks very much like the ferry did when it was raised from underwater, kind of decayed and rotting. It looks very, very similar. But the thing that I think is very important about this story is that he's not left on his own. He's not left to fend for himself or left behind. Instead, all of the other members of BTS come together to kind of circle him, protect him, take him forward into this new future, which I think is really important because, like in Omelas, it says all of these people went alone when they left Omelas, whereas this is that kind of third hidden choice of not accepting the reality and not allowing it to take place, but instead looking for an alternative, banding together to create a change. And so that's something I really love about Spring Day. And in this top right, I love this imagery. It's one of my favourite things in the whole music video, where we have this last shot of them looking up in the snow to this tree, which looks barren, and the colour correction kind of changing from this kind of desolate, dark colour scheme to this bright colour scheme that is kind of implying something better on the horizon, hope for the future. And all of them appear there together. And then this final shot that we have of blossoms coming down, a blue sky, a spring day coming at last, but with the shoes hanging on this spring day. And this is kind of the commemoration of those who were lost and those who had to suffer to get here. So it's kind of this idea of not forgetting the cost of what happened, but not giving up either, not allowing it to happen anymore. And I just think that's really beautiful. And when we tie this into the idea of the group that's suffering, the child, who is the one in the basement, represents a lot of things, but in this specific case, represents the victims of the Sewol tragedy that happened in South Korea. So the Sewol Ferry Tragedy happened on the 16th of April in 2014, and I've just put some images here of some of the tributes to those who lost their lives, and the memorial here with the photos of the victims. It was 304 lives that were lost that day, and one of the main reasons this is so significant is because of what happened and how these children, they were mainly students on the ferry, had lost their lives as a sort of sacrifice because they weren't considered a priority. Their lives weren't valued and didn't have meaning to those in power, those in the authority. Now, I would highly recommend watching a documentary. It's called Crossroads, and it came out in 2019. And it was directed by a British filmmaker who went to South Korea for a long period of time between the tragedy and what happened next, and the protests and the outrage of what happened and the fight of the victims' families. It's got a lot of information in it, and I think it's better for you to kind of see what happened from the voices of those directly involved rather than mine. I'll try to give you a bit of an overview, but I would really recommend watching that documentary. So, some background on what happened. In South Korea, it's kind of been known that their safety measures in terms of disasters and their disaster response is handled very poorly, and that comes from the government and the measures that are put into place from the government. Now, when the ferry began to sink, every life aboard the ferry could have been saved. It did not have to result in the death of any. However, because of the inaction of the government, because of the response time, because of their lack of action towards what was happening, and even how they told civilian rescuers and divers that they were not permitted to go and rescue people, it all resulted in the loss of lives. And another thing very important to note is that a lot of these people were students and were told to stay where they were inside the ferry while the captain and the crew members were rescued from the ship. Now, if those students had disobeyed and had come out onto the deck, had put their life jackets on, had jumped into the water, they all would have survived. They would have been saved, they would have been rescued. But it was because they were told to stay where they were, inside, and because it was in their moral code to follow orders from authority and from elder people, they did not do so. A large majority of them stayed where they were, and because of that, the ferry sank and they were trapped inside and they weren't rescued. So this is what sparked such nationwide outrage at what had happened. It allowed people to see the neglect of their government, the neglect of the authority, the people that were supposed to be in power, protecting those who were vulnerable, and instead not doing so. The captain and 3 crew members were charged with murder for this, and the other 9 crew members were indicted for abandoning the ship. These events of what happened highlighted to the already bubbling of South Korean society of this divide between the generations, between the wealthy and the poor, between the vulnerable and those in power, and made it very clear to the people that they were being sacrificed, that they were not given the same rights as others. Not only was this the case, but the media and the government refused to take any responsibility, kept details hidden. It took them 3 years to even raise the ferry, and this was after the impeachment of their president, because it was all kept quiet, because they didn't want people to know what was happening. The families weren't given justice, they weren't given the truth, and they had to fight actively to be able to just learn what had happened and who was responsible for the deaths of their loved ones. Now, there was already unrest with President Park's government at this time, especially from the youth. There has been a lot of youth activism in South Korean history, and let's go on to talk about that. So South Korea's activism, it's incredible when you learn about their history, and especially in terms of their social movements, because the people have had such huge impact on their society, on their history, and how it's changed over the years, and it's incredible to see their mobilization. So I've put a couple of examples of some of their activism that you can look into further if you want to. It's really fascinating, and these are the ones I've chosen because these are the ones I know the most about. But we have the 1980 Gwangju uprising. This was against military law, and it happened in Gwangju, down in the south of South Korea. And basically, a lot of universities were closed down, a lot of the press was controlled and propaganda was being placed, and universities and youth activists had started creating movements. And then came a huge movement down in Gwangju of the people protesting peacefully and wanting a change to what was happening in their society. Now, the government sent in the military to Gwangju and closed it off from the outside world so no media could get in. Their phone lines were cut off, and what happened was the army rode them down and opened fire on the crowds, and a lot of lives were lost that day, all while it was being blamed on the people for being rebels and fighting against the authority in the system. There's an incredible film about this. I tweeted about it not long ago. It was incredibly moving, and it's called A Taxi Driver, and it talks about this event, so I would really recommend watching that. Now, 1987, one of the most famous in South Korea's history, is the June Democratic Struggle. And if you see on the bottom picture here, this is a picture from the Democratic Struggle. This was one of South Korea's defining moments in their history, as the people of the country came out en masse to protest for their democratic rights, and they finally achieved true democracy in 1987. There is another film about this. I've not seen it yet, but I've heard it's incredible. It's called 1987. It's a longer title, but if you type in 1987 South Korean film, you should be able to find it. It's on my list to watch as well. So then we have the 2016 to 2017 candlelight movement, and this was following the Sewol Ferry tragedy and against President Park's government for this, among many other things that had happened. People protested against her corruption, her abuse of power, her blacklisting, and her media control, and they came out 16 million people peacefully protesting with candles, which is almost a third of the population of Korea, and this happened between November 2016 and March 2017, when President Park was finally impeached and jailed for 24 years for corruption. She was known to be creating under-table deals with the leaders of the big corporations and the cable companies, and her government was ruled in a way that was very corrupt and an abuse of power, as I've said. So she was eventually impeached in 2017, in March 2017, after the constant fighting and efforts of the families of the Sewol tragedy victims and the people of South Korea. And they came out en masse. It's incredible. I really recommend that documentary called Crossroads about the Sewol Ferry tragedy. It goes into all of these protests as well in a lot of detail. It's really well made and really informative. So Spring Day was released on the 13th of February in 2017. So this was a month before the impeachment of the president, and it was directly in between everything that was happening during this time. And again, BTS really were going out on a limb here, because there was a large blacklisting where if you were seen to be criticising the government or showing sympathy for the Sewol victims, then you were blacklisted from the media. But BTS decided to create this social commentary against injustices and provide hope and support for the victims' families and for the people of Korea who were being sacrificed and who wanted something better for themselves, for their children, for the people around them. So the Hillsborough disaster. This was an event that happened in the UK, and it happened in 1989, and it was a football match between Liverpool and another football club. And what had happened was that there were no regulations, safety regulations, and no system from those who were in control of making sure that the environment was safe for those coming. So a lot of fans went through and went into the pens where you could watch the match, and it wasn't evenly distributed. There were a lot of people that ended up crammed in small spaces, and 96 people died from being crushed or from the pens collapsing and then falling. Now, following this event, it has been exposed that the police had secret meetings to decide that they would delete all their notes on the topic and paint this false narrative, blaming the fans and not taking responsibility for how their own inaction had caused the deaths of all of these people. If we look in the bottom corner here at this newspaper article, this was a newspaper that was printed after the tragedy happened. It says, "The truth. Some fans picked pockets of victims, some fans urinated on the brave cops, some fans beat up PC giving kiss of life." Now, all of these stories were fabricated so that the police and those in power who did not send a response in the way that they should have been could keep that under wraps and could place the blame somewhere else. It took the families 25 years to achieve justice for their lost loved ones, and for this to all come out in court and the truth to be exposed. And during that time, the Liverpool Football Club anthem was very strongly linked with what had happened, and that anthem is called "You Never Walk Alone," of course the title of BTS's album, and written on the carousel in the Spring Day music video. And I wanted to read through some of these lyrics, and maybe you'll see how it's very similar to Spring Day. "When you walk through a storm, hold your head up high, and don't be afraid of the dark. At the end of the storm, there's a golden sky, and the sweet silver song of a lark. Walk on through the wind, walk on through the rain, though your dreams be tossed and blown. Walk on, with hope in your heart, and you'll never walk alone, you'll never walk alone." So this was kind of the thing that provided comfort for those who had suffered, and to keep people mobilised and together, to keep hope for people who were being sacrificed and disrespected and mistreated because of the negligence and the corruption of those in power and those in authority. And so BTS's use of this title, I think, sends a very clear message about what they were saying and about how that links to morality and to injustice. So finally, I just wanted to make a couple of comments on Snowpiercer. I'm not going to go too far into Snowpiercer because I might actually talk about it in another video sometime down the line, because it's an excellent film and it has a lot of talk about class and wealth inequality and things like that. It's really interesting. But one thing I do want to talk about is its use of children. And so I think, again, this was a very conscious decision on behalf of BTS to include information about this, because if you don't know, Snowpiercer is set on a train after the apocalypse, after humanity is forced to live here, and it shows a clear divide between those at the front of the train and those at the back of the train in terms of wealth and happiness. So we have the utopia at the front, the dystopia at the back. And the people at the front of the train actively use children from the tail of the train in order to keep their own supply going, in order to keep their own utopia progressing. So this is another topic that ties into Omelas and ties into just everything else we've been talking about. And here's a quote from this film. "Thank goodness the tail section manufactures a steady supply of kids so we can keep going manually." Now again, it's this idea that in our society, life doesn't have value anymore, and some can be sacrificed for the goods of others. And I think BTS is making a very important commentary on how they see what was happening in their own country at the time and in the world in general, because we see it all over. So let's go on to just summarize everything that we've talked about today. So to summarize, we've looked at the story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. We've looked at what the author is intending, how it's kind of a thought experiment, and it's meant to make you question your own views on things, to reanalyze your own society and start thinking maybe outside of the box of what you've been asked, to think about what is moral and what is not moral. And then we've looked into moral philosophy as a whole and what other theorists have said and how this relates to Omelas. And then finally we've looked over how BTS have utilised this form of art and other forms of art to bring it back to the context of their own social environment and to enhance their own message and their own voices in terms of what they want to say and what change they want to see. So I wanted to finish with some questions, and it's things like this, I think, that make me most proud to be an ARMY and love BTS's work and just them as individuals so much. But yeah, so some final questions. What are your takes on the matter of morality and moral theory? Was there any that you specifically agreed with? Did you think things were forgotten from them? Did you think there were other things that should have been mentioned, or things you agreed with, things you disagreed with? Do you see yourself in the story at all? Omelas. Where would you place yourself? Where would you want to be, and where do you think you would be? What do you think your response would be? How does this story translate and change when it's connected to real life events such as Sewol? And how have BTS incorporated it into their own art? So how does this story translate? I mean, it's one thing thinking of it as a story, but it's another thing to think about it in terms of real life events that have affected real life people. Can you think of any other instances where you could relate this to something that has happened maybe in your country or in your life? How does it make the story different when you use it to reflect upon your own world? Do you think you can ever truly just look at it as a story without thinking about it in terms of your own personal environment? And how have BTS used this? How has it enhanced their way of telling their own story? And what significance is it that they used other art forms rather than expressing it themselves, do you think? How does literature and empathy enable us to view morality in a new light? Now, it often is talked about that you can't really understand or be able to make sense of inequalities and injustice without empathy towards others. And so if you have dehumanization of certain groups of people, it's a lot easier for you to not care about their stories, about what's happening to them, because it doesn't matter. And so it's often said that you need empathy to be able to understand other people's plights that you have not personally understood. And one of the ways that it is said that this is done is through literature, is through placing yourself in the position of others is through learning about those others, is through getting to know them on a deeper level, learning their hopes, their dreams, their fears, their struggles, their happiness, their joy, their love, all of these things. So how does literature enable us to do that? And can you think of any other artistic or cultural examples of relevance to this? Other things in artwork that pose similar questions or that show similar stories? So I think that's about everything. I hope that this was enjoyable in some way that made you think. So yeah, let me know what you thought of this video. It's different to anything I've ever done before, but it was really enjoyable for me too. And thanks for watching. I suppose I'll see you next time.
보고 싶다 이렇게 말하니까 더 보고 싶다 너의 사진을 보고 있어도 보고 싶다 너무 약속한 시간 나는 우리 겁니다 이제 얼굴 한번 보는 것조차 힘들어진 우리가 여긴 온통 겨울뿐이야 8월에도 겨울이 와 마음은 시간에 달려가네 홀로 남은 설국 열차 네 손잡고 지구 반대편까지 가 겨울을 끝내봐 그리움들이 얼마나 눈치를 내려야 그 봄날이 올까
벌렁을 떠드는 작은 먼지처럼 작은 먼지처럼 날리는 눈이 나라면 조금 더 빨리 내게 닿을 수 있을 텐데 난 꽃이 떨어져요 또 조금씩 멀어져요 보고 싶다 보고 싶다 보고 싶다 보고 싶다 얼마나 기다려야 분명 밤을 더 세워 널 보게 될까 날 보게 될까 만나게 될까 만나게 될까 숨겨올 뒤틀지나 다시 봄날이 올 때까지 봄이 올 때까지 그곳에 좀 더 머물러서
네가 변한 건지 아니면 내가 변한 건지 이 순간 흐르는 시간조차 미워 우리가 변한 거지 뭐 모두가 그런 거지 뭐 그래 늙다 네가 넌 떠났지만 단 하루도 널 잊은 적이 없었지 나 솔직히 보고 싶은데 이만 너를 지울게 그게 널 원망하기보단 덜 아프니까
이날 풀어내본다 연기처럼 하얀 연기처럼